Okay, you hear me? So thanks, Alexei, and it's great to be here. I'm sorry I'm not Beth Fulton, who would present this much better than I could, but she's actually, how do we get that up? Just, okay, and this is forward, back, okay, yeah, thank you. Okay, so slightly odd title, and really what this is about, I guess, is a theme that's been touched on here and there in this meeting, but it's about ecosystem modelling in a whole range of different guises. In Australia, at least, we've invested quite a bit of money in this area, but in a whole lot of other tools also to support a sort of an ecosystem approach to fisheries, including some of the risk assessment work that we've also heard quite a bit about in this meeting. But anyway, this talk will be overviewing some of the different approaches that we've adopted towards ecosystem modelling. So, and again, I stress that this, for those of you who've ever heard a presentation from Beth Fulton, you will recognise the style. I didn't put these slides together, and I'll try and do them justice. So this is the idea that fashions sort of come and go, and some of them look pretty embarrassing, actually, when you look back in time. But you know, some of them, there are actual advances that go on, and I guess one of the questions is, you know, we've been doing single species work in fisheries for a long time, and now we're definitely moving into sort of ecosystem work. And I guess the question is it just a passing fad, or is it here to stay? And if so, in what form? So the idea is that any of these sort of new fields go through a process of development and possibly eventually stagnation. I think Beth's view is that we're past the toddler stage in ecological modelling, and we're definitely not at the decrepit stage, but depending on your view, we're, you know, either a sort of a toddler or a teenager, or probably somewhere around there. In terms of actual application, now I'm talking about the sort of complex end of the spectrum. I'll talk about some simpler approaches in a little while. But the sort of so-called end-to-end models, there's lots of them around the world now. All the dots there, I think, represent all the EcoPath, EcoSym type of applications. But there are also some other models used. In fact, I think Beth's tallied up about 15 different sorts of models that are used. Some of them are at kind of ocean basin scale. And so in terms of the science, there's actually been a lot of development, a lot of work going on. And so arguably, you know, we are up somewhere in that sort of space in terms of the development. On the other hand, in terms of actually using these models to inform management, there's a lot fewer examples around. And one of the nicest ones actually is Gadget, which is a package that was developed in Iceland, and there's, I'll talk a little bit about that later, and also about an Atlantis application in southeastern Australia, which has gone the whole way into management strategy evaluation and really linking into trying to inform management approaches. So I guess one of the lessons that comes out of these approaches is that it does force you to start to think about the connections and take a broader view, and that can be quite valuable sometimes. In terms of the disciplinary focus brought to bear in these areas, so I come actually from a background in stock assessment, really, and so this is a view of you know, the sort of traditional approach to dealing with management problems, which focus on the target species and stocks and the interaction with the fishery, and maybe we've got some information that comes out of that, and there's maybe, even if we get quite sophisticated, we have formal harvest strategies and so on, and then there's a decision maker that sort of sits there and manages the process. So that's the kind of the conventional view of fisheries management. But then as you sort of broaden your thinking, you start to bring in some of the social and economic factors that influence behaviour and markets and even behaviour of fishermen. You realise that the decision maker is not just listening to the scientists, but there's other processes that sort of go on there. And so we've actually now started to incorporate, so this might bring in notions of fleet dynamics, for example. And so we're starting to model some of these other processes. And then if we go all the way to a sort of a full systems view, then we've got the environment in there and the effects of the environment. We've got food webs, we've got other aspects of uses of the marine environment, we've got society infrastructure, lobbying, and then this notion of governance, not just management, but governance. And I think this sort of view, this systems view, if you like, is very close to what Rob Stevenson was talking about yesterday in his keynote. And so for at least some of the models that we've been developing, they do try to embrace this sort of full systems view of the world. One of the problems, though, is that these models are big, hairy monsters, and they consume both a lot of time and a lot of dollars to develop, and sometimes those buckets of dollars are kind of reducing. And so we also want to have some alternatives to the sort of big models, and in fact they're not always needed, as I'll try and illustrate. So another reason for not always going to the big end of town is that sort of maintain your sanity, and this is just the view that there can be different expectations about what will come out of these sort of exercises. And this one thinks it's going to be something really grand and wonderful, and this one's maybe a bit more realistic. And this raises the notion of this term, which is sometimes used, of minimum realistic models rather than full ecosystem models, as a good way to start to broaden your thinking without going the whole way. This slide I'll just take a minute or two to explain. So I actually led a project probably over a decade ago now that was looking at management problems in a fishery in southeastern Australia, which had all sorts. It was a multi-species fishery, multi-gear fishery, had lots of economic and biological problems, and people were looking for some new thinking as to how it could be managed better. And so we set up a project that was built around this idea of management strategy evaluation. So identifying the range of objectives and performance measures, and identifying alternative possible strategies and evaluating them and so on. And underlying that management strategy evaluation were attempts to model the dynamics of the system. And one of those models was, in fact, an Atlantis model that was getting on for the order of complexity of what we saw a little while ago, that sort of full systems view. But we also, actually, for the first part of the project, did a really sort of cut-down version that was a much more simple model. And in fact, we did those two exercises somewhat independently, and then ended up right at the end sort of comparing results between the two. And it was quite interesting in that if you looked at the actual predictions that were made, so we were predicting out 20 years or so, and across probably 30 or 40 different variables or indicators, and comparing the sort of qualitative work we did with the quantitative work, and essentially, I suppose, taking the quantitative work as perhaps more reliable, but 60% of the time the predictions were virtually identical. And then, in places where they weren't identical, so in some cases the quantitative model was more variable, or there were non-linearities, or there was weak or strong change and so on. But essentially they weren't an exact match, but still informative. And only very rarely did we actually end up with completely different predictions out of those two approaches. So it does tend to suggest that you don't always need the full complexity of the models that we sometimes tend to build. And one of the reasons for that, of course, so this is just an example from that, this time from the Atlantis model of predicting. In this case, this is an orange roughy stock, and this is the biomass predicted and observed in this period. And really, you don't need a full ecosystem model to be able to predict that. They're pretty direct effects of fishing. I don't know if you know anything about orange roughy, but they live at about 1,000 metres. They're not interacting strongly with other parts of the ecosystem. It's a highly targeted fishery and so on. So there are definitely instances when you can get away with just the single species approach. One of the other things that we've spent more and more time on is sort of reviewing and incorporating some approaches to economic modelling into these sorts of models. And some of these have proven to be quite effective. So there are these, and really we've brought these in less obviously to look at things like economic drivers, but more to model things like fleet dynamics more realistically. And so I guess this is a study by Vermaat et al. That was looking in the Bay of Biscay and using what are called random utility and discrete choice models to model fisher behaviour, and in particular targeting of different species in that system. And so what they did was to take a period of time, about 4 years or so. This is a sort of a monthly time period along here, and the black is these are number of fishing trips targeted at different parts of the system, and developed a model that provided a good fit to those sort of patterns of behaviour. And then the question was, how good a predictive model was it? So in this case, they looked at another year's data and just used the model to predict forward, and then compared with the observations, and found it was generally performing pretty well, at least in that short time range. But of course, not always perfectly, and for example here, so sometimes it does matter that you're missing out some bits of the system. Another sort of group of models at the simpler end of the scale are sometimes called extended assessment models. So these are basically single species models, but maybe incorporating environmental drivers. And we heard a little bit about some examples of this from Javier and Margarita yesterday, I think. So this is an example of some work done by Melissa Haltak and others in Seattle. This is sablefish, which those of you who haven't ever sampled it, I thoroughly recommend. It's one of the nicest fish I've ever eaten, I think. They call it black, well, they market it as black cod, I think, in Seattle. Anyway, that's an aside. So this study was looking at possible environmental drivers on recruitment in this particular fish stock. And one of the things that they found was that recruitment, which they had a good measure on anyway, for at least historical recruitment, had some strong correlations with copepod community dynamics. So this is, in this case, these are the sort of more northern or boreal copepod communities, and the more of those there were, the stronger the recruitment. Conversely, the more of the southern group in the California current system, that tended to depress recruitment. So they found some interesting patterns, and then but also because zooplankton is hard to measure, and they started to look at environmental correlates of some of these species patterns. Found one in the inverse sort of sea level measure that seemed to correlate quite well, and then have now been sort of using this time series both historically but also potentially projected forward to sort of explain some of the recruitment dynamics. So that's an example of bringing in some environmental factors. Another example was actually some work done by Teresa Amar. She presented some of it yesterday, but more focused on some of the more recent work. This is older work where she was working with Martin Dorn and Andre Punt, I think, and looking at what might happen under future IPCC scenarios for the pollock harvest strategy, and then seeing whether or not incorporating environmental drivers into the harvest strategy improved or didn't improve the performance. So there are a variety of things that I won't go into that, and Teresa can explain a lot more than I can, but there are a lot of ways in which our basic approach to stock assessment can be extended to include some environmental and ecological factors. So that's okay, but what happens when you do have to worry about ecosystem interactions and trophic interactions? And I guess thinking about that was perhaps one of the motivations for developing models like EcoPath and EcoSym. This is a term that, again, I think perhaps Beth came up with, but Goldilocks modelling. How many of you know that fairy tale? But, it's sort of not too hot, not too cold, just right. Well, this is about the sort of level of complexity in ecosystem models, and so you don't want it to be too complex, you don't want it to be too simple, you want it just right. And that's where this notion of this sort of minimum realistic representation of the system comes in. And Sylvia, in her presentation yesterday, talked about these mice models, which is a term that I think we coined in Australia, but they're models of intermediate complexity for ecosystems. And so the basic bones of most of those, and I'm actually going to run through a few examples now, include potentially environmental or physical sort of forcings, ecological interactions, a human component, not at least the fishery, but perhaps other aspects, and then a management focus as well. So these are models that try and capture some elements of all those parts of the system. The key to them, and again this is repeating pretty much a slide that Sylvia showed us yesterday, so mice in a nutshell. Actually, I think this is Eva's figure. Eva Flagani is doing a lot of this work. So they're of intermediate complexity. They're focusing on subsystems, but including linking biological, physical and human dimensions, addressing tactical management questions. Probably the most important one is that they're fit to data. In other words, and in terms of the broader themes of this conference, they're explicit statistical approaches to uncertainty and to both parameter and model uncertainty. They're simple enough to be able to do this, but obviously you need the data to be able to fit them too. So they can account for a number of major uncertainties, and again, in our system at least, they tend to be developed in these sort of stakeholder expert consultation sort of systems. This is some work done by another colleague, Yun Shin, and this is just showing that, in fact, when you do try and simplify the ecological components of these systems, you have to think fairly carefully about the way you do it. So this is a typical, if you like, this would be like an EcoSym representation of the system with, a fair bit of detail among the fish, so it's a fish-centred model, and zooplankton, phytoplankton in there, but just simply as single inputs, if you like. On the other hand, there's quite a lot of biogeochemical modelling that's sort of very plankton-centred, so lots of detail down here, and fish are maybe just one box. And so if you want to link those two and represent them better, one thing you want to do is consider that there might be different pathways from essentially the bottom of the food chain to the top, and not have it so simple that you don't allow those different pathways to occur. One of the obvious reasons for that is if you think about a simple predator-prey system, if you've only got one predator and one prey, something happens to the prey, the predator will inevitably disappear. But if it's got alternative sources of food, that most predators do, then that gives you a different output. So another issue that arises when you are trying to simplify your view of the world is it depends who you ask. So this might be a biologist's view of the world with lots of biological diversity, and we think that all of it matters, or maybe a lot of it, or it needs to be captured very well somehow. On the other hand, an economist's or even a social scientist's view might be very different. It's about people and markets and social situations and so on. And the ideal would be to try and balance the two, but that's sometimes easier said than done. And in fact, there have been quite a few offline discussions I've had in this meeting about the need to bring together these sort of different disciplinary views, but sometimes how difficult it can be to actually do that effectively. But I think it's something that we ought to be striving for. So a couple of nice examples. This one is in the Barents Sea, but it's using the gadget model that I described earlier. So the system is, again, it's sort of focused on the biological part, so herring, caitlin, cod and minke whales, there's fisheries, there's assessment processes and harvest control rules, there's some basic bits of the ecosystem that sort of feed into it. But these are models, as I said, that are simple enough to actually fit to time series of data and come up with sort of statistically robust estimates of parameters, and thereby giving you a bit more confidence in investigating some of these aspects of management that you're actually providing advice in a fairly robust sort of way. Another example, this is some of was work by Eva Plagani and one of her graduate students at the time. She was still in South Africa, Laura Blamey. But Eva used to do stock assessments on abalone, and those were essentially single species stock assessments. Poaching was a big issue, has been for a long time there. In fact, the main index of abundance for abalone in South Africa is CPUPE, which stands for catch per unit of policing effort. So it's confiscations of illegally caught abalone. But anyway, one of the issues that arose was that those single species models essentially broke down sometime in the early 2000s, and that was as a result of some regime shifts that appeared to have something to do with lobster increasing in abundance, possibly affecting urchins and those affecting habitat and juvenile survival, and there could have been an effect of some of the fish catches as well. So Laura and Eva developed this mice model that incorporated the dynamics of all those bits of the system and used it to explore basically what might have been happening. So this is with the current level of fish in the system. You can see that abalone are going on quite nicely and then actually collapse around this period, perhaps associated with this rise in lobster, but not through a direct interaction, but an indirect one. associated with the decline in the urchins. And if the fish had been at historical levels, you might not have had the collapse in the abalone. On the other hand, the fish which actually prey on the lobsters, you might not have had a lobster fishery either. So, there are trade-offs in this system, but I guess the point is that these biological interactions, at least in this particular system, look like they're sort of key drivers of the dynamics, and trying to understand the dynamics of any one bit without some understanding of the other bits can be problematic. How am I off for time? Alexi, how am I going for time? Okay. I'm nearing the end anyway, so there'll be a bit of time for discussion. So this is another example of some of this nice modelling, this time focused on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, and interactions with this crown of thorns starfish, which is shown here. I don't know how many of you know about this beast, but it has these almost epidemic outbreaks periodically, and goes around and chews up large parts of the reef, and then the reef generally recovers from that, but can take some time to do so. There's still not very good understanding about what causes these sort of epidemic outbreaks of this particular organism, but it's thought that it might have something to do with fishing and fish abundance, and that's affected by both fishing and marine protected areas, which are pretty widespread in the GBR, the Great Barrier Reef. So again, they've developed a relatively simple model of this system, and fitted to data. So this is the last major outbreak, or two outbreaks of the crown of thorns. So this is their density over time, outbreak in 96 and 98. It was thought that this one was influenced by immigration of lots of larvae of this organism from essentially outside the system, and then this was a self-recruitment peak. But eventually it's a classic sort of predator-prey thing where they eat themselves out of a living, and so you get a crash in the numbers. They've also been modelling the sort of crash and recovery of the coral cover, both for some of the fast-growing corals and the slower-growing ones. So again, a system where we've got quite good data, we've got some understanding, we can put together models that sort of describe the system, and this work is still in progress, it's not finished, but the idea was that this will help inform some aspects of management through, not that you can generally directly control crown of thorns, but levels of fishing, levels of protection through MPAs and so on can be explored using these sort of models. Okay, so I guess in summary, in some cases, and we've heard lots of them in this symposium, single species approaches are fine and good enough and work very well. On the other hand, there are a number of cases where these much more complex models are being developed and even being applied to a more limited extent in addressing management problems. But the point about the sort of high-end models is that they're costly and not always necessary. So I guess the main message is about these models of intermediate complexity. There's an increasing number of those sort of being developed. There's no generic approach to them at the moment. They're all almost case-by-case examples. But they do allow us to broaden our view about the system that we're dealing with. And, so improve our understanding, and they're, I think, a useful and feasible addition to the set of tools that we can bring to bear on fishery management problems. There's a nice picture of Beth just to finish off. So Thanks very much.